Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative way. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized and imagined by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Ajay Kamalakaran, is an independent journalist and writer with a special interest in Russia and the Soviet Union. He has lived in Russia and the US and is now based in Mumbai, India. He's the author of many books, including A Week in the Life of Svitlana, that was published in 2019. And I may be getting the pronunciation of some of these words wrong, so Ajay will jump in later and
No,
tell
in
me.
fact, there's a story behind Svitlana. The name is Svetlana in Russian, but this is a
Okay.
story about a Ukrainian nationalist who chooses the Ukrainian spelling and pronunciation of her name. So when the book actually
Hmm.
came out, many Russians said, "Your cover has a spelling mistake." I said, "No, it doesn't." But they said the name is Svetlana. I said, "No, it's not." So that's the story behind it.
Interesting. And we have to jump into that a little more in a bit. And then the other book was Globetrotting for Love and Other Stories from Sakhalin Island, which was released in 2017. And he's also edited a collection on India Russia ties. And his most recent book is Colombo, Port of Call, which came out in 2026. And this book is available for purchase on Amazon.
On Amazon, on the websites of many bookstores, but get
Got
out
it.
of the house, go to a bookstore. You may meet somebody interesting and buy your copy from there.
Yes, let's support those independent stores in your city. So please urge them to get that copy for you. He's also a journalist, and his articles regularly appear on Russia Beyond, Open, Manorama Online, Scroll, and other publications. I will be linking Ajay's books and some of his pieces in the show notes. I also will be linking Ajay's websites and his other conversations and interviews about his journeys and his writings around the world. So please feel free to explore some of that after you listen to this interview. He's done a bunch of really interesting conversations and podcasts on his travels around the world. And I got a chance to listen to some of that and I thoroughly enjoyed them. I think this conversation will really have a lot of stories. As you can see, Ajay's already shared a bunch related to the title of his books. But Ajay, I wanted to start this conversation off with your story. The first question we ask our guests is tell us something about your childhood. Like, what do you remember? Where did you grow up? And what was Ajay like as a student at school?
Okay, first of all, this is a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, it's very difficult for people to spell and to pronounce my second name, my father's
yeah,
name. So it's pronounced as Kamalakaran. And believe
Kamala.
it or not, I was actually featured once by a Malayalam magazine, and they spelt in Malayalam as Kamalakaran, which means something completely different. So I just thought that, in fact, the only place where people actually write and pronounce my name correctly is in Russia, ironically, because they use the Cyrillic script.
I
It's more conducive. So just thought I'd correct
thank
you
you,
on
thank you.
that
I'm so
because it's a
sorry,
pet
Ajay.
peeve.
I should have
That's all
asked you
right.
this before we started. But yeah, let's
That's
let's get
perfectly
started with
fine.
that.
Okay, so about my childhood. Okay, so I was born here in Bombay. It was still officially called Bombay then, and I my father had a transferable job. So when I was quite young, we moved to the United States. So I my formative years were spent in New York City, and I was just a kid who was trying to fit in there at a time when there weren't that many Indian people living in the US. The word Indian was still in many ways associated with Native Americans. So this whole stupid concept of feather Indian or dot Indian was actually something that was openly being discussed in those days. So I grew up in New York, and I went to a private school because New York City was so unsafe that my parents didn't feel comfortable with me going to a public school. You heard so much about people getting bullied and beaten up. But, as you get older, when the school bus system no longer allows you to use it, and then you have to walk in a private school uniform with a tie, and you see kids from rougher backgrounds on the streets, I don't think they take too well to you. So there's no way of escaping certain things, I guess, or you couldn't in those days at that time. But as a child growing up, I wanted to fit in so much that I took a lot of liking for professional sports. So I became a big baseball fan. I started supporting the New York Yankees. And now I don't anymore. I support the Toronto Blue Jays. So the story behind that. But I enjoyed watching sports and playing, though I wasn't really good at any of them, but I enjoyed playing basketball. And I would say my real connection now, all these years later with the US, with New York, is the NBA team, the New York Knicks. I bleed orange and blue. I love that team, and I watch Knicks games wherever I am in the world if I get a chance. And sometimes you bump into fellow Knicks fans in an airport in a third country, and you feel so good. You sit together, and it just binds us. And when you watch the Knicks play in other cities in America, transplanted, jaded New Yorkers are all over the place. So that is a big part of my past, and that played a big role in who I became as an adult. But I will mention that getting bullied as a kid very often also molded me into the person who I am. So I'm very anti-bully, and I always believe in standing up and cheering for the underdog. And that's a big part of who I am as a person now. And when I'm living in a country where I am the average Joe, my name, even though no one can pronounce it, is pretty standard, and I look like anyone else. And I try and make sure that I don't allow anyone to bully somebody on the basis of their background or things that they can't control.
I mean, there were so many things to unpack there, Ajay. Your love for the Knicks, and growing up in the US as a person of color. I think, especially the Knicks, I hope they make it past the playoffs this time. And with Brunson and the group that they have over here, I feel like
This
last
is
year
our
they
year.
got.
We're gonna win.
Yeah,
We're
I
gonna win
think
the
so too.
championship this year.
I hope so, because I think in the Eastern Conference, it seems like they're one of the stronger prospects this year, right?
Yeah, there's Detroit. They're very good this year, and they want revenge. But
I'm a huge NBA fan, though I
mhm.
don't have particular allegiance to like a specific team, but I love seeing how it plays out in the playoffs. And the teams that came out on top last year, they struggled sort of in the playoffs, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
that was interesting.
sure.
I feel like the playoffs are a whole different sort of ball game where
Oh,
you just have
absolutely.
to have this, and I think the Eastern Conference is pretty competitive in terms of getting out of those early sort of games, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
best of luck to them.
Thanks. I mean, I told somebody, oh, but what about 1973? And the person said, kid, you weren't even alive in 1973, which is true. So, yeah.
Well, that shows you're a true fan, though. Because you know your numbers and your stats, and that helps. But yeah,
Well,
I hope
I
this
will
is very
share
good.
one little anecdote with you. It was
Yeah,
1990, and the New York
yeah.
Yankees were the worst team in baseball, and they were losing every single game. And I went for, I think, a game against the Texas Rangers. I lived in Queens. I went all the way to the Bronx, and there were 5 people at the start of the game inside that stadium, which could fit 57,000. And that's, so yeah, I'm actually a proper fan.
Yeah, and so where did you go from there, Ajay? Did you go to university in the US, and what did you
No,
study
what
at that point?
Yeah. So what happened was my dad, like I mentioned, had a transferable job. He had a better opportunity back here in India. And in my teens, I moved back here and I had to study, what was it, 10 years of Hindi in 10 months. Although, since I am an Indian citizen, there was no way around me not passing Hindi and entering junior college or university. I had a terror of a Hindi tutor, somebody who taught at that time. She'd been teaching for over 35 years. And she said, you have to work as hard as you can and then some more. And I've been told that you're very intelligent, but I don't believe your father. So I'm just going to rely on hard work. And so I studied here. My last year of school was here in India. And yes, I got through and I love the Hindi language a lot because of that teacher, but it's a beautiful language. So I'm glad that I had that opportunity. It looked very difficult. It looked very daunting at that time, but I'm something that I really value. And now that I can read Farsi and by default Urdu, it's just wonderful so that you just have so much access to much more than your immediate circle. It's a joy. So I did my last year of school here, joined college, and I wanted to, as a kid growing up, I was fascinated by programs on TV like LA Law and Street Legal. And so I wanted to be a lawyer. And then everybody said, oh, it's too difficult to be a lawyer. I mean, people in your life, they said, you'll end up waiting outside courts, offering people affidavits and services. And If you don't have contacts, it's not a profession for that. This is the thought that I had in the back of my mind. And I actually, so then at that point of time, when you took the public exam, you had three choices in the city in Bombay. You had science, arts, or commerce. And I thought, wow, arts will be fun. I'm like, no, your grades are too good to go into arts, which was a very ridiculous way of thinking. Then there was science and commerce left. And then unfortunately, when you change from the US system into the Indian system, it's like you're losing a few years in maths and science. And I wasn't up to the mark, even though I had the grades, the marks to actually do it. I didn't feel that I could really succeed there, which is, now all these years later, I just love science so much. But it's never too late to enroll for a course. So what happened was I ended up studying commerce. And, one thing I always enjoyed from the time I was a kid was to write. So I started taking part in essay writing competitions. And for some strange reason, I started winning them at youth festivals. And I wrote for my college magazine. And for a couple of years, I actually ended up getting, I can't believe I'm talking about this now, but Best Writer Award a couple of years in a row from college. So I thought, okay, fine. Writing is my calling and I'm going to do this. And then I had a reality check from my dad. Oh, you need a flair for writing, and writing is a hobby. It's not a profession. You can't make a livelihood out of this. And then I said, okay, what about journalism? My dad said, journalism? Journalists do nothing but sit in a press club and get drunk. And he wasn't too far off with that. No, I'm joking. But so I continued in that stream, studying banking and finance for my master's. And I mean, look, if you study properly and you take a bit of interest and you have good professors, you're going to do well. So I went to good colleges and I had good professors. They made the topics interesting. And, I'm very grateful for that. So no complaints about what I studied, but that was just not my calling. That was not my passion. And, I wasn't going to live my father's dream. He was a banker. He wanted me to be an investment banker, to go back to New York, live in an apartment overlooking Central Park. And I don't dream of that. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to see, starlit skies from the desert. I wanted to ski cross country and just to taste different foods and interact with people from different parts of the world and make friends everywhere. In Africa, in, I don't know, East Asia, wherever. So that was my dream. And what happened was, honestly, I was at this stage in my early 20s where I wasn't enjoying the kind of work that I was doing. And I just decided that, okay, fine. If I fail, if I succeed, it's all on me. It's my life. I'm going to take a plunge. I'm going to just try to be a journalist, to write for different publications, to be a freelancer, and to see how that's going to work for me. Then I ended up getting quite lucky. Got, good opportunities, and there's been no looking back since then.
So, what were those earliest pieces that you remember working on, and how did you? Because technically, you didn't have any training in writing, and I assume these publications had very stringent sort of criterias about submitting a piece. So how did you figure that out, and how did you learn how to be a journalist?
Okay, so it's not that I didn't have any training when it came to writing, because when I was in college, I took part in essay writing competitions, and I had an excellent mentor. She passed away many years ago, Dr. Leena Sen, and she got me interested in the works of V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, and many other great writers. She just gave me a list of books to read, and she'd be highly critical of what I wrote. And she said, come on, where's your imagination? This isn't good. This isn't good. But she trained me. So I did get that hands-on training, even though that was extracurricular. But I got that training. The fact that I had the confidence that I was winning these competitions, and it gave me that confidence and that belief that I would be able to do this. So what happened was I started, you have to understand that the landscape at that time, we're talking about the early 2000s. It was very different than what it is right now. So now with all these specialized courses available, with young people having opportunities to go hands-on into these programs and getting the right kind of training, it makes it a lot easier. But also recruiters, also employers at that time, editors, even now, as an editor, I can tell you that I don't particularly look for pedigree or somebody's from such and such a school or university. Those aren't the things I look at. You judge every piece by its merit. When I started writing, I see at that time it was a lot easier just to approach editors and to submit your work. So it's just something that took care of itself at that time. What happened was in my early 20s, I decided that I'd had enough of big cities. So I had enough of Bombay, New York, places that are crowded, densely populated, where everybody's in a hurry. And before that, I decided to learn the Russian language. Again, I'm grateful to my father who encouraged me to learn languages and said that if you learn Russian, you'll have access to 15 different countries. And it was after the Soviet Union collapsed, and he was dead right. So what happened was an opportunity came up, and I moved to the Russian Far East. I also enrolled part-time to study Russian philology and philology, not philosophy. And what it did was I studied part-time and I started working. There was a newspaper there, and it was an English language newspaper catering to expats, basically, because I was in a region which was where an oil boom was just beginning. So a lot of people from the oil and gas industry and their families moved there. When an industry like that sets up, you have the ancillary industries that support it, hospitality, and so it needed an English language newspaper. 2003, the internet wasn't that developed. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have, we still physically access newspapers to get news. Where I was at that place in Russia, no, nothing in English on TV, radio, nothing. And one day I went with a friend of mine to a bar and I was expressing my frustration. I said, nobody speaks English. Nothing is in English. And just having a drink. And then I slammed the glass down and then I looked at a newspaper and it was English and I picked it up. And for me, it was like breathing. Oh my God, it's English. That it was a local newspaper. I flicked the pages and I saw West Indies break I think Australia or West Indies broke India's fourth innings chase record. I remember one of those teams did it. I think it was the West Indies. We had a record from 1975. I actually read that in that newspaper in the Russian Far East. I started flicking the pages. We're looking for writers, journalists, editors. Oh my God. Okay. Now, at that time, I was also freelancing with wire services. If you have somebody living in a remote part of the world whose English is good and who is in a place where it's difficult to access and there's a booming industry, you will get work. But with this newspaper, when I saw that they're actually looking to hire people, I called them. I said, okay, I'd like to work for you guys. And what happened was within the second week of me working, the editor quit and the publisher came up to me and said, guess what? You're the editor now. And 4 years I edited that newspaper. There was no looking back. It gave me a great opportunity to do things at a very young age, a lot of responsibility. And when I'd go for meetings and meet people, they're like, who are you? Who's this kid? They're like, oh, sorry, but your name makes you sound older. And your newspaper is very good. It's very informative. It's well structured. It's got great op-eds. You're managing all this yourself? I said, I have a team. So that was a wonderful experience. It was almost destiny. I lived there in the Russian Far East. I relished it. I fell in love with the country. I'd always liked the culture, but by the time I mastered the language and became just an ordinary member of society, see, I didn't feel at place as a kid. I didn't feel at home as a kid in America. I didn't feel at home as a teen in India, because in America, I was this Indian kid. In India, I was this American kid. And finally, I moved to Russia where I was accepted, loved, welcomed. And it's a country that I have the greatest amount of gratitude, and I will always be in its debt for the way it accepted me and molded me into who I am today. I remember great Mahatma Gandhi said that he was born in India, but made in South Africa because of his experiences there. And I can say this with a lot of pride. Born in India, raised in America, but made in Russia.
I wanted to ask you more about Sakhalin. Am I saying that right, Ajay? You'll have to help me out here.
That's right.
Sakhalin, perfect. And, because when I was listening to the other podcast where you spoke about this on the Musafir Stories podcast, Sakhalin is about 9 hours away as a domestic flight from Moscow.
That's right.
To think about that, that's like an international flight times 2 sometimes, because you can get from India to maybe the Middle East in like a good 3 or 4 hours, or India to Sri Lanka, depending on where you're at. So 9 hours, and I was reading up to prepare for this, I was reading up on the history of that part of the world, and there was a there was a long time where it was a contested region between Japan and Russia, and I was looking at the like Google Maps today morning, and I realized that it's actually very close to Japan on the northern end. It's like this large island that's very close to Japan, and and it's bordering Russia. So, could you tell me a little bit, because you covered it for 4 years, you had these
Right.
stories. When I was looking at your book, and I was trying to look at some of the subjects that you covered, because your first, I mean, in 2017, when you brought out the collection of short stories, it's interesting how you structured it, because there's a story about a cleaning lady, there's a story about a marriage ending, there's a story about a young woman navigating relationships. So,
Or
were these
having the best
people,
of every world.
yeah, so were these people this is a question a lot of people may ask people that write fiction and navigate nonfiction too, but were these people you met along the way? So my question is, can you tell me a little bit about Sakhalin, and then maybe a little bit about how the idea for the book came about based on your experiences about this place?
Well, coming to first of all, Sakhalin Island is, you're right, it's a very large island. It's as big as Japan's largest island, Honshu. It is just north of Hokkaido. It's separated by a narrow body of water called the La Perouse Strait, and Laperouse, La Perouse, French explorer. And it had its own indigenous people for a long time. And these were basically tribes that were East Asian tribes that lived there. What happened was, as Russia expanded further east, it staked claim to that island around the same time that Japan did as well. Now, you can dispute who was there when, but what happened was Russia managed to get complete sovereignty over that island. And then you had the 1905 Russo-Japan War. And when Japan won, Russia ceded half that island to the Japanese. So from 1905 till 1945, the southern half of the island was legally a part of Japan, recognized internationally. What happened was, at the end of the Second World War, after the war was won in the West, it continued in Asia for a few more months. What happened was the Soviets basically took over the southern half of the island and reunited it completely under Soviet Russian sovereignty. And Japan disputed that sovereignty for some time, but they no longer claim the southern half of the island. There's a territorial dispute between Russia and Japan for 4 islands that are called the Southern Kuril Islands. There's actually one of them is a small archipelago called the Habomai Archipelago. So that area is disputed, but it's under Russian control. And the problem is that Russia and Soviet Union, Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union, and Japan are still technically in a state of fighting World War II. So and they haven't signed a peace treaty. And because Japan claims those islands, way back in 2004, Vladimir Putin offered 2 of those islands to Japan, whereas Japan wanted 4, and they refused to accept that. I don't think that offer is on the table anymore, because politically, if Japan takes those islands, there's a very good chance of a US base coming out there. And it's something that's not going to happen. But Sakhalin itself is not a source of dispute, but it has a lot of it's fading Japanese heritage. It's got one unique building there, which, now is a regional museum, but it looks like an old Japanese palace, but it's a blend of Japanese and European styles. And the Japanese consul general who lived there said that there's no building like that in Japan. So it's a very unique and beautiful building. You see graves, you see other small monuments, but the Japanese heritage in southern Sakhalin is more so reflected in the way the cities are designed. These are compact cities compared to broad Russian cities with, extremely broad roads and wide sidewalks. And so you have that feel. But if you take a ferry from a city called Korsakov in southern Sakhalin and you end up in in Wakanai, a city in northern Japan, you feel a civilizational difference. It feels completely different. You've gone from one world to another. But the people in Sakhalin in the 90s and 60s used to listen to Japanese radio because you can still get the radio signal, shortwave. And for a long time, there was a deep interest in that culture. And, there's been a lot of movement to and fro. And a lot of people have visited Hokkaido, especially. And the links are very strong. And we hope that the geopolitical situation improves so that, we can all go back to being friends again.
Yeah, because I can't imagine how hard it would be for people living in that time from 1905 to 1945 to just suddenly re-identify as being part of another country. And
Oh,
another
that
thing
didn't
I heard
happen.
you meant.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
let me interrupt
sorry.
you. That's not what happened. What
Yeah.
happened was when the Soviets took over the southern half of the island, the Japanese
Yeah.
population, they voluntarily left. But there was
Ah.
another problem, which you will, if you, in the book, there's a story about a young man called Vladimir Kim. It's about a Korean there. What happened was the Japanese, they brought slaves because the Japanese Empire occupied the Korean peninsula, and they brought slaves from Korea and forced them to work in Japan and in Sakhalin. So the Japanese did not take the Koreans back with them. So those people stayed back. There, they learned a new language, they adapted, they became a very successful diaspora. Some people moved to North Korea, some to South Korea. This is after the Soviet Union collapsed. It became easier. But these people identify as Russians. They speak the Russian language. They physically look like Koreans, but many of them don't speak the language. There have been efforts. But again, this is a community which is a bridge now between the cultures. And there were Koreans who lived in the Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan as well. And one of Russia's most famous rock stars, Viktor Soy, was an ethnic Korean. And try telling a Russian rock fan that, hey, that guy was Korean, not a Russian, and see what he does to you.
And like you know, I'm so excited to pick up this collection of short stories, Ajay, because I've always been curious about Russian history. Whether it was learning about the Romanovs, that was a family that ruled Russia for a good 300 years and had so much power, and it was concentrated in one single group for so long. And eventually, in the 1920s, the Bolshevik Revolution. Again, my understanding of history is based on popular accounts, and I'd
Right.
love to know. And even like Sakhalin Island, for instance, there was Anton Chekhov. Am I saying
That's
his
right.
name right?
Anton
I love
Chekhov.
Chekhov. So you're you're the Russian right language speaker, so do help me here.
That's
But
okay.
he
You can
wrote
call
this.
me a Russian. I don't mind.
No, but he wrote this account in 1890 where he took this 11-week journey across the country
Yeah.
from Moscow to Sakhalin Island, and that account really showed the world what the country was like, and it was really. I mean, a lot of people know Anton Chekhov as a short story writer, but his life as a journalist is not as appreciated. But that was such an important account. So when you were writing and reporting from this island, were you only talking about stories from Sakhalin Island, or were you also trying to contextualize it in the larger sort of Russian context as well?
Well, I mean, it was a newspaper registered in Russia. It was a Russian, but at the same time, it was published in Russia. It was about Russia. So events that happened in Moscow and St. Petersburg are things that readers needed to know about. So we did include those things. The local news was important. People picked it up for the local gossip. We had a kind of like a gossip columnist who would write things about expats. And the newspaper itself was a bridge between the expats and the locals, because locals who were learning English wanted to know what the expats were doing or saying about them, and the expats wanted to know what's happening in the local community. And I would sometimes end up in a lift and somebody said, hey, what did you write about me? It's like, can we talk about this calmly? So that was a good experience. But coming back to Chekhov, he of course was a doctor, and he went on a medical mission to Sakhalin. So that book, Sakhalin Island, it is very depressing because it depicts Sakhalin at that time was a penal entrenchment colony. If your prisoners were punished, what could be worse than a banishment to Siberia? Going to Sakhalin, which is even beyond. The conditions were brutal. He arrived there in November, and this is a place where it goes to -40 and stuff. The particular parts where he was, towards the central and further northern parts of the island, because he at that time traveled through the Amur River and got onto the Tatar Strait from the mouth of the Amur River. So it was actually quite north. And he wrote about the brutal life conditions there. It's a very, very valuable social document about the Tsarist regime. And what happened was, coming back to my Colombo book, Anton Chekhov, on his way back from Sakhalin, did not travel the same way. He traveled by ship. hoping that he could actually have a stopover in India. But the closest he got was Colombo. So he spent a few days. The exact number of hours is in the book, read it, and what he did there. And Tsar Nicholas II, when he was the crown prince, he went to inaugurate the Trans-Siberian Railway in Vladivostok, but he traveled by the opposite way of Chekhov. So he traveled by ship from Trieste in Italy through Aden. He came to Bombay first. He was in India, then he went to Colombo, and there was actually an assassination attempt on him in Japan before he reached Vladivostok, unsuccessful. But the point is that all these people also they're connected to Sakhalin, they're connected to Colombo as well. I thought I'd just make that point. But coming back to Sakhalin, what happened was after the southern half became a part of the Soviet Union, part of Russia again, it was classified as a border zone and it was closed off to foreigners and Soviet citizens who weren't living and registered there. You needed special permission if you were a Soviet citizen to enter and to be in Sakhalin. And if you were a foreigner, it was next to impossible. But there were a handful of people who did visit. So from 1945 till the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991-92, people living there never had any interactions with foreigners. You saw Indians on TV or Bollywood movies that were screened there and popular. And then in the early 2000s, suddenly this place becomes an island with the third largest population of foreigners in Russia after Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the cultural shock for these people was not something they could have ever counted on, say even 10 years before this happened. And for the foreigners to live in a place where, so little English was spoken, just so isolated for so long. This book the short stories try to convey that. So somebody tried to sue me, the person who claimed that she was Daria from Globetrotting for Love, claiming that I caricatured her, which is not true. Or, people said, oh yeah, cleaning lady, was that somebody who worked in this part of the city? I said, these are all fictional characters. But then you observe life, you observe things happening, and, your mind, it does its thing for you. So living there, living as a local person, fully integrated into the society, speaking the language. I mean, there would be months where the only place I would use English was at the newspaper when I was writing, editing, and talking to colleagues. Otherwise, I'd only speak that language. So I was so immersed in the culture there. And the idea for the book was, okay, those were wonderful times, because what happened was the oil boom, it did get over like it always does. The infrastructure, the gas liquefaction plant was set up and people left, suddenly went back to being a prosperous outpost of Moscow. So if you go there now, you won't believe many of those things you read in that book, that it was even possible for those things to happen. So the idea was in some way to write about those times. My friends there told me, now write nonfiction about your time there. I said, I'm not going to do that. This is enough. You just connect the dots.
Yeah, and why fiction? What was it about that medium? Because right before that, in 2015, you published, a collection. You edited a collection called A New Era about India and Russia's
Right.
geopolitical ties. So, why were you? I mean, because as a journalist, you had the tools to tell a nonfiction account of that particular place. But what do you think?
I did, but there's a story. You can just imagine how somebody looked. I mean, and it's about art, right? Fiction. It's about using your imagination. You can just, you don't make up stuff when you write nonfiction. That's morally and ethically wrong, although people do it. But
Yeah.
Here you have the freedom. Let me just imagine this happened or that happened, and this is how it was. And what I liked so much about the way the book was received was, I expected this Daria from Globetrotting for Love, that title story, for people to judge her, but she turned into some sort of a hero. Everybody said, wow, she's amazing, I like this girl. And in fact, the person who wanted to sue me, probably if she ever found out how much people loved that character, she would actually want to claim it for herself now, say, yeah, that's me, I'm that cool person. So how people looked at it, and there was one, you mentioned the story about a marriage gone wrong. And there was one thing about that man falling into a lawn while trying to get off the taxi. And then he started saying he's telling his mother that he wants piroshki. The funny thing is that somebody who read that said that was my favorite part of the book. And someone else said that they enjoyed it. A lot of people told me they enjoyed that whole story about Vladimir Kim, the Korean. And so what I really liked was talking to different readers and from them telling me that I enjoyed this, I enjoyed that, things that I never thought about. So, when you write fiction, you enter a new world, you open up a new world. So I want to write more fiction sometime in the near future, because that was something I immensely enjoyed. So as for writing nonfiction, it's deeply personal, my experiences there, and being, I don't know if the memories now, because I left in 2007, if my memories are muddled, or I remember things in a way that they didn't happen. I don't know about that. Maybe at some point I'll think of it, but not at the moment. But I'm also really excited that a Russian translation of that book is coming out. I've read the first manuscript. The translator wants to give it more of a literary flair and stuff. And I said, go for it. I mean, she's a very good friend of mine. She worked with me in that newspaper. She was my deputy editor. She's now a head librarian in Sakhalin. So I'm very excited about that. And the funny thing is, when that book actually came out, I donated a couple of copies to the library and people kept borrowing it. One day I went to the library and saw the number of stamps on it. And they said, these are people who don't speak English. They heard that this was a caricature of life at that time, and they wanted to know whether something about them was written. I'm like, oh, wait, I know this guy. I know that guy. And it was hysterical. And every time I went back, they said, that's not what really happened. And I said, you're right. That's not what really happened. It has nothing to do with reality.
Yeah, I think fiction can do such a great job in talking about those gray areas that sometimes, nonfiction can't really capture in the same detail, because you have to stay true to the fact.
Right.
And I was also looking through some of the Goodreads descriptions and reviews, and there were lots of people from Russia also talking about the book in a way that said that you were able to, in that book, capture some of the essential realities of what it was like to live in Sakhalin Island, which I think was really interesting to see as a reader interested in this story. But in 2019, Ajay, you wrote another book, another fictional story called A Week in the Life of Svetlana.
Svitlana.
Svitlana. Again, I think by the end of this, I will get a bit better. But Ajay, tell me a little bit about that book, because this is about the everyday life of a character balancing, employment, raising a family. But why this particular character, and why didn't you, as a writer, why did you choose to embody the female perspective in this sort of narrative? And what were the challenges of doing that in a cross-cultural context, because even though you spent some time in Russia, you're still an Indian writer telling like a Russian sort of, what were the challenges of that, and the story behind that book too?
See, the thing is that we know what's going on right now in Ukraine, and it makes me really sad. Frankly, if I had known back then that few years later, these kind of things were going to happen, you can't predict the future. So to be frank, what happened was this: in 2014. There was depending on your geopolitical leanings, you can say there was a revolution or there was a coup, and pro-Russian, a government friendly to Russia was replaced by one that was outright hostile. And you have to understand that the Soviet Union was, it was an entity where people of all sorts of different ethnicities lived all over the place. Sakhalin Island has many ethnic Ukrainians. They're Russian speakers. They don't speak Ukrainian anymore. They've been there for generations. So, just by looking at somebody's last name, just like here, we can say that a Menon is from Kerala, I don't know, like a Sen is from West Bengal, or Mehta can be from Gujarat or from Punjab. You can tell by the names. You can tell Ukrainian names easily apart. And until the collapse of the Soviet Union, there weren't internal borders. This wasn't a different country. So many ethnic Russians live in Ukraine. Many ethnic Ukrainians live in Russia. This outright hostility is something that happened after 2014. And what happened was, throughout, because, I've obviously in Russia very often, and throughout after 2014, you had talk shows on TV discussing politics in Ukraine, the geopolitical situation. And if you read comments on online forums, there were people who were ethnic Ukrainians who supported the Ukrainian cause, or, what happened was after with Crimea. And for me, at that point of time, again, This is set in the summer of 2015, the autumn of 2015. And one of the most beautiful autumns that Moscow's ever witnessed. Was, warm in the day, cool at night. And because of that, you could walk around in 20-degree weather and see the most beautiful autumn foliage imaginable because of this combination. And at that time, one real flashpoint was this. And what I wanted to do was just to put out a novella, just a short novel about uh, life, fast-paced Moscow life, and link it to the geopolitical situation. And because I have plenty of friends in both Russia and Ukraine, and whose views are greatly divergent, and within these countries as well. So there are people who oppose their respective governments, and it's just normal human behavior. And the idea was just to try and put a snapshot of Moscow, to feel like you're there in the city. When people visit Moscow, they go to the Red Square, they go to, maybe to the Chekhov gallery, maybe they go to the Novodevichy monastery, but that's it. There are 5-6 places. I'm in Moscow, I see these things, St. Basil's, the Red Square, and take the metro, I'm done. But it's a city in its so-called Spalny Rayonov, areas, sleepy areas where you just have just housing estates and buildings and stuff like that. There's a completely different life. The average Moscowite doesn't go to these places. I wanted to kind of show life in Moscow in 2015. And I chose this theme because this is something that was really hot, and something that was being openly discussed at that point of time. But the end result was, it ended up irritating Russians, it ended up irritating Ukrainians, and they kept saying, but if she's such a nationalist, why does she live in Moscow? And I said, this is a fictional person. She doesn't exist. No. I know people like her. I know plenty of people like her. They have an apartment in Moscow. They have a good job, and they hate Russia. They're pro-Ukraine. And at the same time, these people in Ukraine said, oh, but you portray us so badly. You portray Ukrainian women so badly. So the whole, I don't know. I mean, I think the impact was it ended up annoying an incredibly large number of people. But, I think it's a fun, breezy read. You feel, when you read it, you feel like you're in Moscow. You understand the metro system. You understand all these dynamics of a post-Soviet era. You understand what's good, what's bad. And the whole idea was, again, this book was a simple mirror to Russian and Ukrainian society. Here, take a look. This is it. Take a look. But after what happened in 2022, it really broke my heart. And I just hope that there's peace everywhere. And at the same time, this is a book, like I said, it depicts that particular moment in time, those thought processes. It really should be frozen from looking at it from that perspective. I mean, it was out in 2019, and then less than 3 years, later, all this happened, and then people said, "Oh, this character actually kind of predicted a war. Svitlana was an oracle of some sort."
Yeah, I mean, I also often wonder, like some of my other friends that also write fiction, and sometimes I feel like as readers, it's unfair for us to critique the author and expect them to have a character that is polished in all their within all their identities. When
Right.
you were talking about a human being, you're also talking about their darker shades. I don't think
Of course.
fiction has the responsibility to tell you only the best parts of the human story, right? And I think,
Dostoevsky did it with The Idiot, and he
yeah,
created the perfect human being with Prince Mishkin. And, hats off to him. We should all be, well, maybe not have the same choices in love as Prince Mishkin, but then he tried his best to create what he thought was the perfect human being. But
yeah,
I mean, look, I think that any work should be open to critique.
yeah.
Somebody said, "Oh, this book is over explaining things. You're not allowing people to draw their own conclusions," and it's fine. I mean, I'm open to criticism. If somebody doesn't like what I
Yeah.
write, it's up to them. It's fine.
It's a
That was
story, right?
Sure,
And
exactly. I think writing is a work in progress. You have to continue to evolve. I'd like to
Right.
believe that what I wrote 10 years ago and what I write now, I think I've improved. I'd like to believe that.
Yeah, I think like an hour and a half is too less time with you, Ajay. You have too many stories and too much life experience to
Oh
pack
dear.
into such a small amount of time. So I have so many questions about, I wanted to ask you about your process of learning languages. And
Right.
also, as a journalist, I was looking through some of the articles you wrote in the Open magazine or in Scroll, and
Hmm.
they're about such interesting topics, and I was just curious, how do you scope? But before we jump into those two parts, I wanted to talk about your book that you released very recently, Colombo, Port of Call. Now, I've been to Colombo once. I thought it
Hmm.
was one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
I agree.
I got a chance to stay in Mount Lavinia, which is this awesome
Wow.
resort. And I know it's not all of Colombo, but I was like, wow, this is like
Yeah.
paradise on earth. And they had their
Yeah,
own
I'm a Mount Lavinian. So
you
I'm very much a Mount Lavinian. That is my favorite
awesome.
part of Greater Colombo. In fact, my book, Globetrotting for Love and Other Stories from Sakhalin Island, was actually written almost entirely in Mount Lavinia.
How interesting. Because I know you mentioned that in the interview you sent me as well, which I will
Right,
link in the show notes too. You spoke about how you enjoy writing in Sri Lanka and in Colombo in particular. But
right.
your book in 2019, there was like a 7 year period between that book and the book that's coming out now,
Hmm.
about 7 to 8 years. So how did the idea of the book Colombo, Port of Call, came up? And can you tell me a little bit about your travels to that city
Right.
over the years and how it led to the book as well?
Sure. See, Colombo is a home away from home for me. You can see the flag here. It's a city that I really love, and I have, very close friends there, and I would, actually call them family, not friends. So it's a place that I've been going every year since 2003. I was even there during the Boxing Day tsunami, and there's another story which I don't want to get into right now because we don't have much time. But it's a place that I feel completely comfortable in, look like any local person out there, blend in easily. So, as an Indian person, for most of us, I don't know, it's not so easy if you're a turban wearing Sikh, of course, but it's a place where you can feel you're abroad, but you don't stand out. You're completely anonymous. So, you look like, any local person. And there's a feeling of comfort knowing that you're not in India, but you still, in many ways, feel like you are. And it's a good place, for me to have some rest and relaxation, some downtime, and it's peaceful. It's peaceful. It's quiet. Those are the things that really help you collect your thoughts and to write better. So what happened was, a close friend of mine there in Colombo said, "Look, you come here and you write books about Russia. When are you going to write something about Sri Lanka? When are you going to write something about Colombo? I mean, we like your books about Russia, of course, but." The idea then came to me because I do write articles for Scroll, like you mentioned, my favorite publication. And the idea came to me that, okay, I mean, when I'm in Colombo, I see a lot of old buildings, I see a lot of heritage which is fading. And, each of these walls have a story to tell. Each of these historic hotels, these iconic ones, had some incredibly illustrious guests. And I thought that at one time, I've always been enamored by the idea of traveling by ship, not to go on an expensive cruise, but what could be better? I mean, at least for me, to just hop onto a ship and then go from here to Karachi and Bandar Abbas and to um, the ports further up the Gulf and and just travel again through the Suez Canal, or just so for me the idea of ship travel is fascinating, and it's unfortunately not available now. You can't just take a these kind of cruise ships. Of course, when I did research for this book, I understood that it wasn't as glamorous and fun as it looks because the conditions were tough, especially if you were traveling third class or something. The idea was to, I started just reading up more and more about famous people that came there. And now that Colombo and Sri Lanka is such a popular tourist spot and people are flying in, and, when I go to a place, I always like to know about its history. I'd like to know about who was here, what they did. And I thought one way of linking history and travel writing together was to write this book, was to show. I mean, see, we are big cricket fans here. Don Bradman never played here in India, but he did play there. And it was only because Colombo was the port of call, the first port of call from Fremantle when they were on their way to Europe and then, to England to play the Ashes. So, and for many people traveling further on, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was traveling to Australia to give lectures. So he stopped by twice on his way back. So the idea was write about these people, their experiences. And when you go to these places, if you spot some place which is in the book, okay, oh wow, this is, Mark Twain was here and this is what he commented about this place so many years ago. What do I think? So the idea was to try and, just show how Colombo was very different now than it was then, but how it was at one point of time. And at the same time, to understand that there's a lot of this nostalgia industry where they show old world charm and play nice music from the past and talk about simpler, easier times. You have to understand it wasn't simpler, easier times for everyone. And to understand the impact of colonialism, all these things, they just gel together, and I decided to write this book.
Like my question, Ajay, to you is that your stories, they exist in a cultural and political context, right? I
Right.
know
Yes.
Colombo is this major tourist hub, but it's also a country that has gone through an extended civil war. So when you're writing about a city in that context, right, you have to stay sensitive to those political realities as well. And because you are presenting the perspective of writers that may have come from the empire that was using this place as a colony, right? So, was there an inherent tension in how you were talking about this city and the narrative you were sharing about it in this publication, too?
Well, see, this is the era that is covered in this book, the golden era of steamships, of ocean travel. So the first story is set in the latter part, but more, the mid of the 19th century. And the last one is with the Don Bradman story. So it ends in 1948. So the ethnic conflict is something that just did not exist at that point of time. I do address colonialism there, of course. Some, you know, you like I said, I've mentioned not everything that was said about Colombo or about Ceylon, Sri Lanka is flattering. It's important that you mention these things. There were people who disputed the story of the Temple of the Tooth, saying that somebody said it looks like a horse's tooth, and it's disrespectful to those who believe that it's the tooth of the Buddha. But I did address the impact of colonialism. I did address the racial hierarchy, about the plantation economy. These are things that were addressed in this book, and I don't explicitly talk about it, but these are there, and it's very easy to understand where I stand on these kind of things. In the introduction, I mentioned very clearly that it's very easy for us to look back at the past and say that, oh, those were the good old days, without understanding the impact that it would have had on people like us who were people of color. So, no, what I wanted to say was that I do address the impact of colonialism in this book. And there are unflattering things that have been said. And some of these people had some things that would be considered unacceptable in this day and age. But in the introduction, I make it very clear that it's easy for us to look at old world charm and listen to jazz and Duke Ellington and then just think, oh, those are the good old days, when they may have been the good old days for a small number of people, but as people who were inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, those weren't the easiest of times for us. If you were the Maharaja of Patiala, of course, it wouldn't have made any difference to you. But the average person would not have been able, that racial hierarchy existed, and the kind of things that were said at that time would not be acceptable in this day and age. So these things are considered, but this book has absolutely nothing to do with the ethnic conflict. That's something that happened post independence.
Yeah. And I think that clarity is helpful because it helps us situate the book in a particular historical timeline as well. And I think that part of history is maybe what you are focusing on in this in this particular publication. But I was speaking to Gopal, and he told me, and I was reading through his review as well of the book, and he mentioned that in the book it's interesting how you navigate certain smaller elements of for instance, when people travel to a country, they talk about the sites they visit, the food they see, the people they talk to. And I think travel is a combination of so many of these experiences, and I think you have a very unique stance on travel writing based on what I've read of your journalism, and I'm really excited to read this particular book as well. So, like he mentioned something about how you spoke about the story of coconuts and how fishing boats, had this Southeast Asian sort of roots. So, maybe you could tell me a little bit about these two elements of the book. And
Sure. I mean, look, see, first of all, since we don't board ships anymore to travel. In fact, they used to be, I think, right till the early or late, I think till the early 80s, there was a ship that you could take up to Bushehr. You could take it to, Gulf ports and stuff. So the whole concept of boarding a ship and getting off, we don't even understand and know these things anymore. So we kind of assume like a plane, lands and you get off on the runway or through an aero bridge, or when you drive somewhere, a train goes into a railway station. Because of water, the element of water is completely, it's different. If you ask anybody in their 20s to explain the very concept of boarding a ship, they wouldn't be able to do it. So you had these outriggers, these ships, which when a ship came and it was on anchorage, then people would get off and they'd have to sit on one of those and then travel up to the jetty and then get off. That the concept wasn't there that you just climb down the stairs, and then that's not how it was at a particular point of time. So I think Gopal found that really interesting, the particular craft that was used to take people. And there are many stories about this because many travelers noticed this particular kind of a boat that was taking people to the jetty from the ship. Regarding the coconut plantations, yes, the Dutch looked at maximizing income from the coconut. So a lot of the western coast of Sri Lanka, from Colombo all the way to Galle, now it's lined with beautiful coconut trees. The stereotypical image of paradise, blue waters, golden or white sands, and coconut trees behind you. A lot of that is due to the fact that the Dutch made an active attempt to do this. I think he may have found it interesting because he did the same thing in Kerala as well.
Yeah, and I know in the interview you also mentioned your strong connections to being a Malayali in I mean there's a very strong Malayali population in certain parts of Sri Lanka, and I was really interested in that migration over time, and I made that connection between how in your book about Sakhalin Island, people come from all over the world to stay in these places.
Right.
It's not just about, those identities of being from a country have like a story to it, and I think it's the same for our biggest cities. But Ajay, for the last two questions, the first thing I wanted to ask you is that I know you're someone that really believes in this idea of slow travel,
Sure.
and I was just curious about the philosophy behind that. What do you mean by slow travel, and why do you think it's different from the regular forms of travel that most people engage in when they go to another
Right.
country?
Okay, so just coming back to that about Malayalis, we have to understand that the community didn't build there the way the Tamil community did. So a lot of people, they married Sinhalese women and, they blended in. And there were some disturbances in the 1940s against them. But elements of Kerala culture blended in effortlessly because Malayalis and Sinhalese are virtually first cousins. So they're so similar, the good and the bad, they share these things. So it's not, the heritage exists, but it's not that it's had as much of a visible impact as a Tamil culture out there. I just wanted to clarify that, so that since you mentioned this topic of Malayalis. Regarding slow travel, see, I'll just take an example. I went for a concert yesterday here in Bombay. Beautiful, was a Russian choir singing high energy music and a whole blend of things. Large number of people were recording the whole thing throughout the concert. I was just thinking, wait, is there attention on the musicians, or is it, you want to make sure you record this so you can show it to somebody? And then I didn't record. I enjoyed the concert. I was there. Slow travel is about physical presence. It's about observing your surroundings. It's about being where you are. It's about being in Mount Lavinia and enjoying the sunsets, or having a drink or tea at the Mount Lavinia Hotel, walking on those warm sands, going for a swim, and not documenting the whole thing. You can write about it later. You can take photographs. I'm not saying don't do it, but slow travel is about appreciating where you are, being a part of your surroundings, and enjoying yourself, doing it because it gives you satisfaction, not to impress other people, not to say, oh, I was there, and I'm better than you because, or, these terminologies that they use, FOMO and things like that. I'm against these things. I like to, in this conversation, you have my undivided attention. When I travel, I try and give my undivided attention to my surroundings, to the people I'm with, and I don't neglect or ignore messages from family. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I'm part of a place. And sometimes when you travel slowly, it's almost like living there. It's almost, you if you live amongst the locals in a community where you know where you absorb the local way of life and you're not going to a neatly packaged place which suits tourist needs. I think that's a better way. There's a difference between a tourist and a traveler. I believe I'm a traveler, that I'm rarely a tourist anywhere.
Love that. And Jeff, for the last question today, you've written so many books about Russia, and your recent book is about Sri Lanka. But apart from the books that you've written, if you had some recommendations about books by writers of fiction, writers of nonfiction about these two countries, if you had a couple, I know there must be a bunch you've reviewed or read yourself, but
Mhm.
I would love to explore these countries more. I may not be able to travel to them,
Yeah.
but do you have any recommendations? It could be
Okay.
films too, or
Well,
yeah.
honestly, I mean, my favorite book there are a couple of books about Russia that I really love. And one is Owls of the Eastern Ice. And I'll write these, you can actually put them in the comments later. Okay. And there's the Amur River by Colin Thuburn, who, I mean, is one of the greatest travel writers of all time. Maintains a low profile, but he travels by the Amur River from China, Mongolia, and Russia. And it is an absolutely fabulous piece of travel writing. He went to a place called Komsomolsk-na-Amur, where the fictional Darya from Globetrotting for Love and Other Stories is from. See, this is a slow travel. He went there, he observed the place, the people, and he even knew about the most famous, dreaded local gangster of that city. Now, I can bet you, of all the foreign travelers who've been there, they would not know about this guy called Jam. And he did. So I tend to be skeptical when people visit Russia and they write travel. This one just blew me over. It's a piece of inspiration for me. So when it comes to Russia, what else did I like? I would recommend this film called Derzu Usala. It won the Oscar, I think, in 1975. It was an Akira Kurosawa film, which is set in the Russian Far East, and it's about a person from the indigenous communities who has that name, Derzu, and this is a great story behind it about how they wanted to film the autumn. Then one night there was like a storm and all the leaves fell off, so they actually uh, made paper leaves, colored them, and hung them on trees. And that's a great film. So it's about this traveler called Arseniev, who's one of my heroes. Then about Sri Lanka, there's this book written by this author called Andrew Fidel Fernando. He traveled as a Sri Lankan, as a local who's married to a New Zealander. He traveled across the island. That's a beautiful travel book. I mean, he's a well-known cricket writer, but he's got a great sense of humor, and I absolutely love that book. Of course, there's the Booker winner Shyan Karnatilaka's writing. Don't just read his Booker-winning book. There's another book called The Chinaman. A lot of writers. There are a lot of great writers whose work is not widespread enough and takes an award, like Abdul Razak Gurnak. His books, he could not find a publisher in North America. They said, oh, this isn't interesting. And after he won the Nobel Prize, everything changed. But didn't mean that he became a great writer after he won the Nobel Prize for literature. So yeah, I would think there's also a book by Nihal de Silva, The Road to Elephant Pass. Then I would recommend short stories from Ceylon, Good Little Ceylonese Boy, a girl, I think, written by somebody using a pen name, Ashok Ferry. So there are some, excellent books that you'd find about Sri Lanka. Then, when it comes to Russia, let's see. I mean, look, of course, the classics are great, but, there's also, I have to really think this one through because, I do read quite a bit. So these recommendations, I'm sure, read the book about the Amur River. You will not regret it. In fact, you won't be able to put it down.
Awesome. Please do send me these names in a
Sure.
short message, Ajay. I will be including links to them and ways to purchase them as well in the
Sure.
show notes. And again, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories, but I think the best way to engage with Ajay's work is to read the books that he's written. I will be including links to purchase these books in the show notes. I really enjoyed reading his journalism as well, and he's got a great website where he's linked some of his pieces, but I will also link his profile on certain publication websites where you can explore some of his journalism as well. Ajay has also done a bunch of other interviews around his travels, around his books, and those will also be in the show notes. But Ajay, thanks again for doing this. I really thought this was such a fun conversation. Yeah, and
Absolutely.
sorry, Ajay, go ahead.
No, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Ajay. And please stay tuned for more such stories on this podcast. And on that note, we come to an end of this episode. Until next time, keep learning.
See you. Bye.